Welcome back to Seneca Falls. We're here at First Presbyterian Church, and I'm with two of our former First Amendment First Vote participants to meet Reverend Leah Ntwala, the current pastor here, and author Julie Suk. They're both going to share interesting and intriguing details about the proposed ERA to our U.S. Constitution. That proposed ERA was first introduced at this very historic church.
I'm Reverend Leah Ntwala. I am the minister of the First Presbyterian Church here in Seneca Falls, New York. I have been the pastor here for 10 years, and in fact, I am the first female pastor to hold this position. This church is on the historic registry. The reason is that in 1923, the Women's Convention was held in this space, and from our pulpit, Alice Paul first declared the Equal Rights Amendment publicly. And the Wesleyan Chapel, where these events first began, the Declaration of Sentiments first began in 1848, was no longer a chapel. So they needed a space that could host as many people. And so that was brought here. Of course, in 1923, women did not hold governing board positions in most places, but certainly not at the church. And when you look at our church's historic records, what you see is those women from our church who were part of the Planning Commission, their husbands served at the governing board of our church, which would had to have approved this being held here. And I find that interesting because it lets me know that women, while they didn't have necessarily the titles, they certainly still had power. It was Katie Stanton's daughter, it was Harriet, who brought Alice Paul to this place and said that this is the woman who needs to be taking on the next wave, the next fight, now that the women have the right to vote, that this is the person, this is the voice that's going to propel us into the future. So learning about the processes that she learned while abroad in England, and then coming back and applying them to the work of the women's rights movement here, and then looking as a pastor, looking at those examples to see how can we further connect those things, because these issues aren't over. Hello, Seneca Falls, New York. I am Alice Paul, and I am delighted to be here as part of the 75th convention. I am grateful to be in this space of the First Presbyterian Church, as the Wesleyan Chapel no longer is a chapel at this time. I am a person who has never doubted that equal rights is the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but for me there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality. So here on this day, July 21st, 1923, I declare the Equal Rights Amendment, which says that men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction.
My name is Julie Suk. I'm a professor of law at Fordham University School of Law and author of We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment is a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which would guarantee equal citizenship stature for men and women. The Equal Rights Amendment reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The Equal Rights Amendment was first introduced in 1923 in Congress, and many women who had fought for women's right to vote thought that we needed more than just the right to vote in the Constitution, that we needed a guarantee of legal equality. Even though it was introduced in Congress in 1923, it didn't really get off the ground. There wasn't enough political support for it, and a lot of women were worried about how it would be interpreted by judges, who were mostly men, for a very long time. So by the time the Equal Rights Amendment was actually adopted by Congress in 1972, and went to the states for ratification, it had plenty of support. A vast majority of both houses of Congress supported it in 1972, but the states did not ratify it in the requisite number. Now, it's important to understand that our Constitution makes it very, very difficult to add an amendment to the Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the state legislatures 3/4 of the state legislatures is 38 out of 50. And by 1977, we had 35 out of the 38 required, and Congress had put a deadline on the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. That deadline was set for 7 years from the date of adoption, so that deadline was initially 1979. And so the ERA was presumed to be expired or dead for many, many years. And it's only recently, since right after the Women's March of 2017, that 3 additional states ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Even though we got to 38 ratifications in just the very recent past, it still has not been added to the Constitution because there are legal and political disagreements as to whether or not the original deadline and the extended deadline that Congress imposed on the states for ratification should be recognized. Almost every country in the world has a provision in their constitution guaranteeing equal rights to women, and the United States does not, largely because we have such an old constitution and one that's so difficult to amend. The idea that women and men have equal citizenship stature in our fundamental document, I think that's necessary in any country that calls itself a democracy. Even though we achieved some of the changes that the proponents of the ERA were fighting for in the 1970s, we didn't achieve all of them. Women have been fighting for it for 100 years, and they've had some success that has been expressed in Supreme Court decisions, but I think that if we don't add the ERA to the Constitution, we'll continue to live in a state of undervaluing and making less visible the accomplishments of women as constitution makers. The most important thing right now is to get engaged, find out who their representatives are in the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate, and find out if their elected representatives support the Equal Rights Amendment and the specific efforts to remove the deadline so that it can be added to the Constitution. And if they have representatives that don't support it or are ambivalent about it, they should write letters and be vocal in any way possible to make clear not only that the Equal Rights Amendment matters to them, but also to think carefully about what they would like in their generation a commitment to equality in the Constitution to mean.
Please add your voice regarding passage of the ERA to our U.S. Constitution.
You can access the Explore More link on the First Amendment First Vote website to learn more about the proposed ERA as the 28th Amendment.